author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We've got quite the special lineup for you on today's show because so much is happening across America, specifically in the nation's capital. So we're going to be discussing the rise of the progressive movement currently led by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and ask whether they are actually representative of the Democratic Party or whether they're an insurgent brand, much like the MAGA movement was within the Republican Party back in 2016, and ask whether they actually have the energy, the power to take over the party. We'll also be looking at the future for the Federal Reserve, what's happening with those upcoming rate cuts that everybody's talking about. And also we'll be discussing constitutional amendments, how they happen, and why they keep popping up their ugly heads. All this and more on today's show. And remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by Liberty Nation, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Thanks for being here. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm Mark Angelides. We're joined by Liberty Nation's editor-at-large, Mr. James Fight. Jim, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, what I want to talk about today is there's so much going on with challenges against the Donald Trump administration agenda. And we invariably hear this is unconstitutional. Whether it is or not, I mean, that's a determination for scholars and ultimately the Supreme Court to decide. But you wrote a fascinating piece a little while ago on on the pages of LibertyNation.com regarding the amendments that never quite made it. And I thought this is an absolutely fascinating topic to get into. So, Jim, give us a brief overview of the constitutional numbers, the amendments, the proposed ones versus the ratified ones, just so we can get an overhead view on it.
Sure. Well, Mark, most people are familiar with the Bill of Rights, of course. Less so most of the amendments, the 17 amendments that came afterwards. But probably very few people are familiar with the 6 amendments that were actually passed by Congress, but never fully ratified by the states. Or, well, I guess that's the debate these days for some of them is.
Well, you're referring here to the Equal Rights Amendment, which seems to raise its ugly head every few years. Well, it seems to be when there's a Democrat in the White House, but let's we'll delve into that a bit.
Yeah.
So there were, according to your article, there's like 11,000 attempted amendments.
Yeah, almost 12, like 11. I think the full number. I went with kind of a vague estimate in the article because there are different
ways of counting.
Numbers, but somewhere around the vicinity of 11,700.
So out of all of these, most have just gone nowhere, and there are 6 that Congress passed. So there's a couple of ways, isn't there, to actually achieve a constitutional amendment. First one being, what's the first one?
All right, so the most common way that this happens is, or sort of the primary way, is for someone to introduce to Congress a bill that is a constitutional amendment. Now, it has to pass both chambers of Congress by a 2/3 majority, right. And then it has to go on. It's sent to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the state legislatures of however many states you have at the time. So right now we have 50 states. That's 38 states. In the past, of course, there were fewer states and therefore fewer had to ratify. But 3/4 of the states have to then vote to ratify these amendments. And then, of course, the Archivist of the United States will then submit it to the Federal Register, and it becomes part of the Constitution. The other pathway is for 2/3 at least of the state legislatures to vote to hold what's called a constitutional convention. If at least 2 states vote for that, if at least 2/3 of the states vote for that, then Congress is obligated to hold a convention where it's basically Wild West. Anybody can propose an amendment.
Mm.
It gets a vote on. The state delegates at the convention then vote on the amendments, and whatever amendments get 3/4 of the state votes, it becomes part of the Constitution. So,
Either way, it's a tricky route to a
yeah,
constitutional
it's
amendment, which
not
is
a
why there's only
play.
27,
Almost
right?
12, yeah, almost 12,000 actually introduced to Congress. Only 33 passed by Congress, and of that, 27 became actual amendments.
Yeah, the most recent one being the 27th, which I think
Which
is one of my favorites, which
Mhm.
it's the one that Congress, if they're gonna issue themselves a pay rise, it can't
Yeah,
be for the Congress that they're in.
right. Yeah, no pay raise. Well, okay, so the funny thing is that's actually our founders, like one of the ideas of the founders of
Yes.
the nation. That's in the original in the original draft of the Bill of Rights, it was like 20 amendments. But in the original draft, um the Senate passed was there were 12 amendments.
Mm.
And what we call the 27th Amendment now, which was ratified in 1992, was in that proposed list in 1789. That was Article the Second. It was the original Second Amendment.
So it only took 240 odd years
It took
for them to get around to do it, right?
202 years, I think, from being passed
Oh,
by
yeah,
the
yeah.
Senate to being ratified by the states. Yeah.
So it's a slow process. Now, the reason that this keeps coming up about the ratification process, well, very quickly, Jim, just give us a rundown, just a bullet point of the six that haven't made it there, the non-ratified
Okay.
amendments.
So the first one is the original First Amendment, which is that the number of representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives would be limited, well, I mean it is limited, but would be set to no more than one representative per 50,000 people.
50,000 people, yeah.
Yeah.
That
Which
that
back then kind of made sense.
yeah.
They didn't go for it, but
It's about
it makes more sense
6,000
then.
or so now, isn't it?
6,800 representatives is what we have.
6,800. There you
If that
go.
were the case, they're about 310 million people in the
Yeah.
U.S., something
And
to that
then
effect.
there's one that would have
There's what I call the anti-13th Amendment. There were actually a couple that would have been the 13th Amendment if they
yep.
had been ratified. What I call the anti-13th Amendment, 13th Amendment is so the 13th Amendment is the hey, you can't keep people as slaves amendment, right? Well, what I call the anti-13th Amendment was proposed and actually passed by Congress in 1961. And interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln actually had reached out to state governors and tried to get them to ratify this amendment, not necessarily in support of slavery, but to prevent the Civil War. That obviously we know that plan failed, but that amendment would have made it unconstitutional for anyone to try to amend the Constitution in a way that would prevent that would interfere with states handling their own domestic policies.
Hmm.
And it explicitly says, including, and this is paraphrasing here, but including, it doesn't use the term slavery, but it says including the basically the forced labor
Yeah.
for the state. Which was very clearly, I mean, if you look at if you read the time, the times that this happened in, it was very clearly a protect the state's right to have slavery. But because of the way that it was vaguely worded for political reasons, it would have actually extended out to, oh man, pretty much any domestic policy. I mean, think
Sure.
about, federal gun laws would be null and void if the state differed. Stuff, all kinds of
So
stuff.
there's
Like
ups and downs. There's ups and downs
yeah,
with that
yeah,
one.
no doubt. Like I don't think, I'm certainly not arguing, oh man, what a
Sure,
shame, but
sure. Let's cut that list short. Though. If anybody wants to carry on reading about those, they can go to Jim's article on the page of libertynation.com. Just a final word, Jim. The
yeah,
Equal Rights Amendment that keeps coming back again and again and again. Will it ever be over for that particular amendment?
I don't think it will. And here's why. A lot of these amendments that didn't get ratified are still technically eligible. But because there was no time limit, but the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, had a time limit of 7 years, and it just simply didn't happen. But in 2021, Virginia ratified the amendment, decades too late and became the 38th state. So some people argue that it's legit. By the wording of its own law, it is not.
I mean, that's also ignoring the fact that several states have actually rescinded their ratification
voted to rescind
of it anyway,
their
so it's
ratification.
still not 38. Jim
Yeah.
Fight, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're on Liberty Nation Radio with your host here, Mark Angelides, and we are joined by Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor and guru. Andrew, thanks for coming in. I think what I want to talk about today is the upcoming suspected rate cuts coming out of the Fed, and specifically, why is it taking so long? Well, a couple of questions for you here. Number one, why is it taking so long to get here? Number two, is it a political decision rather than a fiscal decision that's pushing this potential cut? And number three, what do you think it will be?
So for your first question, there are many reasons why, according to the Federal Reserve, they're not behaving like the European Union, where they're aggressively cutting interest rates. For one, of the earlier the year, there was concern about elevated inflation, and of course, inflation is still above the 2% Fed target. The other concern was about, according to Jerome Powell, the fundamental changes of immigration, fiscal, regulatory, and trade policy by the new president. And so now they're just waiting for, according to them, greater clarity of the effects of tariffs. So they're terrified to do anything at all, whether to raise rates or cut rates, just any backlash they have. Because according to Powell, it's a challenging scenario in this situation, because on the one hand, tariffs could revive inflation threats, which would have to force the Fed to keep interest rates higher for longer. But on the other hand, tariffs could lower economic growth. Therefore, they would have to cut interest rates. But that also threatens inflation again. So that's the reason why they've been reluctant to continue cutting interest rates.
And so that brings us to the political angle, Andrew. Is there some politics taking place behind the scenes here rather than fiscal forethought?
Well, of course, I mean, the Federal Reserve has a long history of playing politics. That is since the days of Mariner Eccles in the 1930s under FDR. It has a political issue. Jerome Powell insists that he is not playing politics at all. But it's just the timing of everything where you have to think that he is playing politics. Now, of course, on Donald Trump's part, he's demanding that Jerome Powell cut interest rates. You know, he calls him a, quote, major loser, and that he has to lower interest rates now, otherwise he risks slowing the U.S. economy. So, you know, if I'm Jerome Powell and I'm constantly insulted by the president, I would have to think that I want Trump to get some sort of comeuppance by keeping rates higher for longer, because we're all human, of course. Even Jerome Powell isn't a robot. He must feel insulted having Trump insult him constantly. But you know, whether the Fed is a political institution, just to summarize the answer to your question.
Okay, and so the third part was when and if I think you told me off camera earlier that it's like a 58% chance that there's going to be a cut come June, and so if that goes ahead, what will that mean for? Well, across the board, really, what will that mean for refinancing America's debt? What will it mean for home buyers, things like this?
Well, I mean, it would be 25 basis points, so it wouldn't be much.
No.
I mean, and also rate cuts, interest rates generally by the Fed, they have a lagging effect. You know, the research on this could be from anywhere from 9 months to a couple of years. At the same time, economists in recent years have said, well, the market is always future forward looking, and they always depend on Fed guidance. Therefore, the market could react earlier than what history has suggested, because the Fed has always been a clandestine agency, but now they're more open and they provide that forward guidance to the Federal Reserve. But you know, the White House, I mean, they've said for a few months that they no longer care what the Fed does, and that they're going to take actions to lower the 10-year yield. But based on Trump's comments, it may look like that he's panicking, whether it's based on his Truth Social posts or pausing the reciprocal tariffs.
So if the quarter base point drop happens, that doesn't really do much for it. Just quarter point. It doesn't really do anything for the $9.5 trillion debt balloon that needs to be refinanced this year, does it? What can the Trump administration do to get that debt refinancing at a better rate? Can they call 0800 debt refinance? Well,
1-800 Doge, because this Doge agency, which of course I was always skeptical that it would achieve anything of substance, they have to find cuts. They have to dramatically cut spending. Otherwise, you're never going to bring down the treasury yield to a sustainable level. I wrote an article recently on LibertyNation.com talking about the Besant Blitzkrieg, how that push to lower treasury yields potentially backfired, because you still have the 10-year yield at around about between 4.2 and 4.5%, even when you had that financial the market crash post Liberation Day. So there are many fiscal side that a lot of investors are fearful of, and that the administration keeps saying they're making cuts and they're trying to bring in revenue and they're doing all these the wonderful fiscally responsible things, but it has yet to show up in the hard data.
So when Donald Trump says it's essentially we don't care what the Fed does, is he really just banking on the actions that he's currently taking, as in, as you point out, having Doge seek out savings, applying tariffs and trying to, or organize some? I'm presuming that he's trying to organize as close to free trade arrangements as possible with all these countries that he's put tariffs on.
Well, I would say that. No, well, I would push back. I would say that Trump probably cares very much. Is that the language?
Sure.
Let's say language from Scott Bessent is very different. I mean, Scott Bessent has been the voice of reason so far in the administration on the economic side. I mean, according to the Wall Street Journal, he's been pushing back against Trump and others surrounding him with all this criticism of Jerome Powell and threatening to fire Jerome Powell, and then Donald Trump said the other day, I'm not going to fire him. I'm going to allow him to finish his term. But if you didn't have that voice of reason in Bessent, I'm pretty sure Trump would try to do something to get rid of Jerome Powell, because Kevin Hassett, he's one of the top economic advisors of Trump, a real MAGA guy, and he told the press before the Good Friday holiday weekend, he said, we're studying ways to try to fire Jerome Powell. And a lot of people said, "Oh, that could cause havoc in the markets." And this may go off board here, but Elizabeth Warren, she was saying Trump demanding interest rates is bad for the markets. But right before the election, she was demanding Jerome Powell cut interest by 75 basis points. So, the Federal Reserve, and you said earlier, is a political institution. This shows right here how everyone is playing politics with the Federal Reserve, because they know how important the Federal Reserve is to the swamp.
Yeah, it seems that whichever way the wind blows is the way that politicians want to be sailing in. Now, let's say either Jerome Powell is somehow pressured to be removed from office, or he finished out his term, which I think finishes 2026 anyway.
May 2022.
Okay. Before the midterms. Interesting. So who then is next in line, do you think?
Before Bessent was selected to be Treasury Secretary, there was a report coming out that said Kevin Warsh was going to be the Treasury Secretary for 2 years and then serve as the Federal Reserve Chair. Back in 2018, Kevin Warsh, a former Fed governor, he was one of the top contenders to be the Fed chair. Of course, Trump went with Powell. Kevin Warsh, he's been on the media circuit recently. He's been just complaining about Jerome Powell and the Fed, how the Fed doesn't have a certain direction and they don't know what they're doing. So I think Kevin Warsh is probably going to be the likely successor. And Michelle Bowman, who was recently upgraded to the Vice Chair of Supervision, she's also a wild card who could succeed Jerome Powell. So those are the two names to watch.
Yeah, always watch those wild card picks, like at Wembley for the tennis. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined today by Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Thanks for coming in, Graham.
Pleasure, Mark.
So I guess what I want to talk about today is we're seeing an insurgent progressive movement within the Democratic Party. And I'm reminded very, very strongly of 2015, 2016, of the insurgent MAGA movement within the Republican Party. And now, I guess this is 10 years down the line from the start of MAGA, MAGA under the form that Donald Trump brought it in. That's the dominant ethos of the GOP. Now, is the same thing going to happen with the progressive movement, or did it have its chance already and blew it?
Well, you could say there's a lot to unpack there. I think that the bottom line is about leadership. Any political movement, whether it's new or just a kind of a rehash of something that came before, but it needs a strong leader. It needs someone to kind of coalesce around. And that person to drive it forward, because as people have, mentioned often before, the whole MAGA, America First populist thing wasn't really invented by Trump. It was already there. It began really, I guess you could say it began with the Tea Party. Some would argue maybe that it's been around, lurking in the background even before that. But, and the Tea Party itself wasn't actually very successful, really. Ultimately, it really kind of blew over, and it was kind of already perhaps in decline when suddenly Trump came along and revived that whole
political ethos.
Yeah, that whole thing. He kind of revived it and suddenly made it into something that was really challenging to the establishment. And of course, the rest is history kind of thing. Whereas the progressives, they don't really have a specific leader. I mean, they have lots of people kind of out there shouting and screaming and singing and making the rest of us cringe as we watch it. But they haven't really Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, they're not really leaders, because neither one of them has any charisma. Let's face it. They do a lot of shouting and screaming. Bernie Sanders obviously has got his own little zealously loyal following, but I don't think there's enough of them to make a difference. So basically, I think the MAGA movement found its leader, the progressive, this kind of new kind of radical progressives who are, really got their claws into the Democratic Party now and are transforming it. But nevertheless, they still don't have a strong central figure to kind of drive them forward.
Yeah, I think you probably got that right. And it's interesting that you mentioned Bernie Sanders there, because obviously the guy's been in politics, I think, longer than I've been alive. But he since 2015,
I think he spoke out against the assassination of Julius Caesar, if I remember.
He did, or for it. You never know with Bernie Sanders. So you have you have Bernie Sanders, who's been in politics a long time, and he's been fringe for a long time. I mean, he's so fringe, he's still technically an independent, right? Despite running for the leadership of the Democratic Party.
I lose track of his affiliation, honestly, because one moment he's an independent, then he's a Democrat again, then he's an independent.
Well, I guess for him it's about coalitions. So when Trump first came to
in fact, I'll just throw in real quick. Sure. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'll throw in that actually that is just about the only thing I do like about Bernie Sanders is that he is not party loyal.
Sure.
He views political parties as just a tool to be used to his advantage. He's not particularly loyal to he's never been a loyal Democrat. And I like the people out there who are not loyal Republicans or loyal Democrats. So that's one thing I do like about Bernie.
Well, some would say that Karl Marx wasn't a loyal communist either. But still. So you had this situation when Trump was on the rise. And at the same time, you had Bernie Sanders, who was also on the rise at that very same time, 2015, 2016. And the supporters for both men were largely interchangeable, I think. But I knew people then who, when asked, like, well, who are you going to vote for? When it eventually, when the primaries finally sort themselves out, and it's like, well, it's either Bernie or Trump. And it's so weird because they're such different figures. But you're right, they have, Trump definitely has the charisma. Bernie Sanders, but he doesn't seem to have that. So I think what he's doing now is he's kind of hitching his wagon to what he sees as the star power of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who who really doesn't have much in the way as what I'd see as a political philosophy. I think she's more a vessel for the far left fringe ideas. There's not one that she doesn't seem to adopt and clasp to her chest and start championing, even though, no matter how ill thought out they are. And so, but the two of them together, they appear to be the vehicle that's trying to thrust the progressive element to the forefront of the Democratic Party, to the point where there's a lot of talk about AOC primarying Chuck Schumer for his seat in the Senate. But I wonder if the progressive have already had their shot, because they had Joe Biden, who was elected as a moderate but governed as a progressive, and then you had Kamala Harris, who embodied everything. She jettisoned her career as a prosecutor, putting black men in jail for drug use, whilst smoking drugs herself, as she admitted on more than one podcast. But then she became this is the progressive dream, and she failed. So I wonder, I just don't think it has the energy to carry on, does it?
I don't think so. And I think part of the problem here, the way I see it, is twofold. Is number one is, I believe that the progressives, or the people who maybe consider themselves at the forefront of the progressive movement, or the leaders of the progressive movement.
We're looking at you, Cenk Uygur.
I'm sorry?
We're looking at Cenk Uygur. Is it Cenk Uygur?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, though. Another guy, yeah. Of course, he's disappointed a lot of progressives recently, because he's actually pointed out that, Trump is not quite, the worst person who ever lived, as they try to make it out. But no, I think the problem is, number one, is that I believe that the progressives don't understand that there are not actually that many of them, in comparison to the entire voting population of the US. They're certainly not the majority, and they're not even a large minority. They are a small minority. Out of all the people who vote Democrats, the loudest ones are always the zealous progressives. So it gives one the impression that, there's an awful lot more of them than there really are. So I think that's part of the problem. And again, I think to a certain extent they lack principle. And I think the people behind the scenes, the real astute, savvy operatives behind the Democratic Party, do realize that these people lack principle, because, we kind of conservatives and libertarians, those of us who are on that kind of side of the political spectrum, we're often pointing out their hypocrisy. And it's constant. It's constant. One day they will say something, and then the following day they will say something which completely contradicts the spirit of what they said the day before. And I think that that's a real problem. As you compare to the kind of the Make America Great Again movement, it largely is based on a set of principles that they are following through on, and that people really believe in. The progressives seem to change their mind from one day to another, and it's largely driven by what Trump is saying and doing. And that's their other problem, is that they're reactive rather than proactive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Graham. Now, we're going to be back with Graham J. Noble after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain Mark Angelides, and we continue our conversation with Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent, Graham J. Noble. Thanks for sticking around, Graham. Now, we've been talking about the progressive movement versus the MAGA movement, and the energy that each side has or doesn't have. And there's something I want to continue on, that is that it seems to me that what's happened is the progressives within the Democratic Party, as you pointed out earlier, that they're a very small minority. They're not even a big minority. But the progressive ideology is embedded in many institutions. And I'm looking at you, academia. They have a stranglehold on how the university and college system works, what it teaches, what values it espouses, and let's be completely blunt, what propaganda it's going to indoctrinate in your children. And so that's potentially more powerful than political power, isn't it?
Well, it is in some ways, certainly. I mean, obviously, everything is ultimately decided at the ballot box. You know, which ideologies people follow, which ideas and policies people decide to favor comes down to who they vote for. But the thing is, you know, on a wider kind of cultural aspect and the general thrust of American society, yeah, the progressives have an ideology which is now disproportionately dominant, you know, when you compare it to their numbers. And, you know, and you said, you know, you mentioned academia, and that's where it comes from. It's because these schools and these college campuses, they are churning out, you know, indoctrinated hardcore progressives. And these people with their degrees in, you know, gender studies or wherever they got their degrees in, it doesn't seem to matter anymore. They're going out there, and they're going out there into the corporate world. They're going out there into the world of government, you know, and they're getting, you know, they're ending up several years later, they're ending up in influential positions. And so now you've got this, you know, progressive ideologies, that various different ones that are, you know, kind of baked into the corporate world. They're into government, you know, so there's, while there's relatively few of them, the hardcore progressives, they, because of their stranglehold on the world of academia, that allowed them to get their claws into everything in America. And it's changed it.
You see it in the entertainment media as well. And I'm not talking about CNN, the entertainment media. I'm talking about like movies and TV. And I can't be alone in this. And I'm sure I'm not a man of, what's the right word? Tender sensibilities, to say the least. But, you know, I don't watch much television or movies in general. But one thing that's sure to stop me watching something is as soon as they start with the speeches, they'll have one good episode, two good episodes. Like, oh, this is something I might enjoy. The narrative's good. The story's good. You know, it's telling a fundamental story. They're following like the hero journey. And I love looking out for that in shows. But then it'll stop. And for some reason, there'll be some kind of speech about something that has no bearing on the story. And it's being put in there because the message has become more important than the medium. It's Jordan Peterson did an interview with Joe Rogan a few weeks ago, and he mentioned something. He talked about something to do with how parasites have attached themselves to various institutions. And he pointed out something that's quite interesting, just as an aside. He pointed out that animal species evolved sex to avoid the parasites because it created a divergence of genetic material that couldn't be easily replicated by the parasites that would go on. And he talked about how the parasites, and here he's talking about people who would use an institution's value and an institution's resource for its own good. That's what he means when he's talking about parasites there, I think, for its own benefit. And that's exactly what's happened. They've hijacked television, movies, academia, as you point out, political institutions, and as we've seen in recent weeks, even the judicial system to some degree. Graham, is there a cure for the, I think, is it Dr. Gad Saad calls it the parasitic mind virus? Is there a cure?
I think the cure is already with us, actually, and I think the cure is Trump's brand of America First populism. And I think a good example of how that is the cure is the fact that, well, it is the way the 2024 election turned out. I mean, you know, during the Biden administration there, the progressives were really going all out, and they were employing all of their tactics. And you talk about parasites. One thing that they've done for a while now, and they've done it extremely successfully, is that they have hijacked movements that have already got the personnel, already got the resources. They're already out there in the public eye. They are powerful, kind of single interest groups or whatever. For example, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was entirely and very quickly hijacked by the progressive movement, to the point where at one time I went to the Black Lives Matter website just out of interest to see what they were talking about. And it was all about transgender rights. And there was almost nothing on there about black people for a while. They kind of changed it back after a while. But for a while, the whole BLM website was about transgender stuff. And they do this. They hijack movements. They hijacked the environmentalist movement.
Yeah.
They've hijacked all these movements, and that's how they disproportionately wield kind of cultural power and influence, is by hijacking movements that are already in place. And of course, and then they have this bullying tactic, because your average Democrat voter does not go around actually bullying corporations, like, unless you do things our way, we're not going to buy your stuff and that. But the progressives do. And they do this. They invented cancel culture. Look what they did to Tesla. So they're very good about that. But I believe the cure is actually the America First agenda. I think it's the cure.
Yeah, well, the evidence seems to point to that. But I wonder if there's not something. I'm wondering if the way to defeat, because some of these institutions were all once quite respected. Like, your Harvard University used to be one of the top 10 universities in the world. And you have organizations like the national brand of Black Lives Matter actually seem to have some drive about, pushing for equality. And there appeared to be something valuable about it, even if there weren't. But when people don't recognize that, and I don't really like using the word parasites, but it's a good analogy. But let's drop the parasite bit here. But
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
We're not calling people parasites. We're saying that their behavior is on a kind of a parasitic level.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what you have is people who are looking to take your organization, to take the thing that you've built and the people before you have built and made, let's carry this one along, and made great. That it's been made great by people's hard work and commitment to whatever that particular thing is. And what they're doing is they're coming along and they're co-opting it, and they're using it not for any particular agenda, because this ideology, it's paper thin. It's paper thin. They don't believe it. They're using it for their own personal power, their own personal advancement, and their own personal goals. And until people realize that, you can't let these hijackers in, they are going to take your organization and they're going to use it for something that you will no longer recognize. Graham, final word. Can America's great institutions make a comeback?
Well, that's an interesting question. Can they make a comeback? I think ultimately they've got it's a long road. The road to return is a long road, but I think they will start down that road when the finances start to get squeezed just so much that they can no longer bear it. And then maybe I think they'll be on the road back.
Yeah, free market economy tends to be the great leveler for all things. Graham J. Noble, thanks ever so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
And that is all we've got time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Mr. James Fight, Andrew Moran, and Graham J. Noble. And of course, I'd like to extend my thanks to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each and every week and join us. And please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks again for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.